Sometime around the year 1200 BC, human civilization hit a wall so hard that it took centuries to recover. Within the span of barely a generation, the interconnected superpowers that ran the Eastern Mediterranean vanished from the map. We are talking about empires that had stood for hundreds of years, boasting sophisticated writing systems, diplomatic alliances, international treaties, and sprawling trade networks. And then, almost overnight, the palace doors were kicked in, the cities burned, and the lights went out. To understand how radical this was, we have to look at what came before. The Late Bronze Age was a remarkably modern world. Kings wrote letters to each other, addressing their peers as "my brother." They traded luxury goods, negotiated peace accords, and formed royal marriages across thousands of kilometers. A merchant in Ugarit could trade Cypriot copper for Afghan lapis lazuli, while an Egyptian scribe drafted shipping manifests on imported papyrus. Everything was linked. The major players of this era formed a tight club. In Egypt, the new kingdom was at the height of its administrative power. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire commanded a formidable military machine. In Greece, the Mycenaeans ruled fortified hilltop citadels with bureaucratic precision. Further east, the Elamites, the Babylonians, and the Middle Assyrian Empire held sway over Mesopotamia. These were not fragile tribal settlements. They were massive, highly organized states, and yet, starting right around 1200 BCE, nearly every single one of these powerhouse societies fell like dominoes. In the Levant, prosperous coastal trading hubs were systematically wiped out. The bustling port city of Ugarit was incinerated so thoroughly that archaeologists found silt and ash burying weapons where defenders made their final stand. In the Peloponnese, Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos were sacked and burned. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was emptied, stormed, and put to the torch, bringing an entire imperial dynasty to a dead halt. In Canaan, fortified strongholds fell one by one. Of all the great powers of the Eastern Mediterranean, only Egypt and Assyria managed to survive the ordeal, and both emerged battered, exhausted, and radically diminished. For generations, historians treated this catastrophe as one of history's greatest detective stories. What could possibly possess the power to annihilate an entire international system all at once? The oldest and most dramatic culprit comes straight from Egyptian temple walls, the mysterious Sea Peoples. Ancient inscriptions describe coalitions of sea-borne raiders sweeping down the coastlines, overwhelming everything in their path. Armed with cut-and-thrust swords, javelins, and shields, these fighters moved in fast, irregular formations that completely dismantled traditional Bronze Age armies. For centuries, the kings of the Near East had built their entire military doctrine around the chariot. Elite nobles, backed by long lines of static spearmen, ruled the battlefield with speed and composite bows, but against swarms of aggressive, mobile infantry who refused to fight in orderly ranks, the rigid chariot tactics fell apart. Yet blaming the collapse entirely on wandering raiders misses the bigger picture. Raiders do not show up out of nowhere to destroy an entire hemisphere unless that hemisphere is already rotting from within. In recent decades, climate science has revealed a far grimmer reality that lay beneath the surface. Sediment cores, tree rings, and fossilized pollen from across the region paint a clear picture of a brutal mega-drought that struck the Mediterranean basin right at the turn of the 12th century BCE. Rainfall dropped drastically, and it stayed low for generations. For civilizations that relied on massive agricultural surpluses to feed their dense urban populations and support their complex bureaucracies, this was an existential nightmare. Royal correspondence from the final days of the Hittites is full of desperate pleas for grain. When the crops failed year after year, famine set in. Starving populations fled the countryside, flocking to the cities only to find empty granaries. On top of the drought and crop failure, the geology of the region decided to make things even worse. Geological surveys show that between roughly 1225 and 1175 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean experienced an intense cluster of major seismic activity known as an earthquake storm. Fault lines ruptured repeatedly across Greece, Western Anatolia, and the Levant, leveling fortifications, smashing aqueducts, and leaving already desperate cities completely defenseless against outside attack. When you step back and look at the whole board, the collapse becomes clear not as a single disaster, but as a classic systems collapse. These empires were so hyper-specialized and deeply interdependent that a shock to any single part of the network reverberated through all the others. To produce bronze, you needed 9 parts copper and 1 part tin. Copper was plentiful in Cyprus, but tin had to be hauled across perilous trade routes stretching all the way to Central Asia or Western Europe. The moment drought caused social unrest, bandits and raiders severed the trade roads. Without trade, there was no tin. Without tin, there was no bronze. Without bronze, armies could not rearm, farmers could not maintain tools, and rulers could not enforce order. Each crisis amplified the next. Drought led to famine. Famine led to mass migration and internal revolts. Earthquakes shattered defensive walls. Severed trade routes broke the economy, and into this collapsing, defenseless vacuum swept the migrations of armed raiders looking for fertile land and survival. By the time the dust settled around 1150 BC, the grand palatial economy of the Bronze Age was gone. The art of writing disappeared from Greece for hundreds of years. Entire cities were forgotten, and the population of the region plummeted. Out of that long, dark age, human society had to reinvent itself from the ground up. With bronze unobtainable, blacksmiths were forced to turn to a cheaper, more abundant, but far more difficult metal to work with: iron. Small, decentralized communities replaced the all-powerful imperial palaces, eventually giving rise to new alphabets, new political ideas, and the first classical city-states. The old Bronze Age died, but from its ashes, the modern world began to take shape.